Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Christine Dixon of the Ordinary Sacred, and I wanted to make a special video today to invite you to do some parts work, some just exploration of parts around things that might be activating you at this time of year, whether it's a certain election or um, holidays, family, things that are going on in the world. Last night was the first time I had a hard time sleeping since we've been here in Ecuador. We've been here 6 weeks or more, and it was the first time I struggled to sleep. And I think it was because my parts are anticipating going back to the States. It's 2 weeks from now, and so my parts are really active in my head, about worrying about this and that and different stresses with family and holidays and selling our house and the election tomorrow. And they're just really loud and chattering a lot. So today, um, that angst that was kind of inside of me spilled over at breakfast. Those parts were just kind of really emoting to my husband. And then he had parts that were trying to help and fix. And we were walking back to where we're staying here. And I said something like, I think I just really need to go inside and have a parts meeting. And because my husband knows that that's so valuable, he didn't take that personally or offensively. he said, yeah, I think that's a great idea. He said, because I have parts that protect me in certain ways, but they're not necessarily helpful for you. And your system is, has angst about different things than I do, and you have different protective parts, and you know yourself the best. And so I did that. I took time and I really met with my parts, and it's always, always the best thing. And then afterward, because I take notes, I listen to what all my parts are saying. We brainstorm strategies together. And afterward, I told my husband, would you like to hear what my parts said and what happened in my parts meeting? And he was so sweet. He said, yes, I'm always interested in learning more about you. And so I'm just giving this example because this is an example of what I mean by being our own primary caregiver and then allowing our partners, our friends, other people to be our secondary caregivers. That it's not that we don't need them. It's not that we don't need to be valued by other people, to be listened to be connected with other people, or to have support and love. But it's secondary to the support and love that we provide inside first for our parts. Otherwise, we expect other people to be something that they cannot be for us. They can't be available to us 24/7, and they can't know us in the most intimate, detailed way, like we know ourselves and all of our history and all of our parts and thoughts and emotions. So I really wanted to share what I did with you. And again, it's around family, holidays, and the election. And what I'm going to do is actually combine internal family systems and nonviolent communication and kind of show you how simple it can be to combine the two to really have it's really like yourself is mediating and listening to all the different parts inside of you. So yourself, your capital S self, in my opinion, the natural language of self is nonviolent communication. So there's a natural flow within using identifying the emotions that the different parts are feeling and the needs, the unmet needs underneath, and then strategizing creatively of how can we get those needs met. So, um, just a one piece of housekeeping before I share this with you. This Thursday, in a few days, November 7th at 1 p.m. Central Time. So that's going to be a different time for me now because our time in Ecuador here doesn't change. But I'm on Eastern, so it'll actually be 2 p.m. for me. But adjust that to your time zone. We're going to have the Grok party. And Grok is basically a company that's created these card games to help you practice and communicate using nonviolent communication. It's the first product that I'm like, yes, I'm fully on board with endorsing this because I already have Grok products. I have used them with my parts inside, with my partner, with my kids, my grandkids. Um, so I'm excited that on Thursday we're going to have this Grok party. And it's just playful, playing games in order to learn nonviolent communication because it really is like learning another language. It's so interesting. I have these vocabulary cards and vocabulary words where I'm trying to learn Spanish and increase the number of vocabulary that I have, number of words. And it's the same in nonviolent communication. We actually met a couple here and we mainly spoke Spanish to them. The girl partners that speak Spanish and the guy speaks English, but we all spoke Spanish together. And we talked to them about using the language of feelings and needs to help them communicate with each other. And they made these beautiful cards for us with all the feelings and needs in both English and Spanish. So it's like I'm learning Spanish and nonviolent communication with these cards. It's really great. But I'll put the link to register for Thursday. It's totally free. If you want to come and play nonviolent communication games with us, just to practice your feelings and needs vocabulary. But I'm going to give you an example of doing that on the inside right now. All right. So what I do when and you can do this in real time with me and just kind of pause and do it yourself and then listen to my experience. But what I do, I often will call it a round table parts discussion. And so I get a piece of paper and I draw a circle in the middle, and it's kind of like the round table, and I put the topic on the table. Sometimes it's very general, like just what's alive in me, and I start to notice whatever's alive in me in general. But I like to do a specific topic that's pretty activating, I'm noticing for my parts. So what was happening was, as I was thinking about going back to the US, to Texas, to Houston, um, my parts started going on and on about what do I need to do for each of my kids in order to, I guess, make sure that they know I love them and I'm invested in them. But there was just a lot of stress and angst that was coming up for me around it. So the topic on my table is holidays, kids, complicated relationships. Um, and so I put that in the center of the circle. And then what I do is I just hold that in my attention. This is the topic, and I notice what is alive in me. And I often will say that I observe my pets, right? Anything physical sensations in my body, emotional energy, and thoughts. And really, sometimes one or the other is more prominent. So just whatever I notice. But sometimes they really are very, very blended. And so what ended up happening with this one was it was really these big emotion words kept coming out. So the first thing that I noticed, and again, you can try this before I share with you what's coming up for me if you want to. Just put the topic in the center of the paper and just observe. You can even draw a little stick figure and note where you feel it in your body, what emotions are coming up, and then around the emotions, like what's being said around them. So for me, the first thing that I noticed was a feeling of deep sadness and grief. And I often will feel that as like a heaviness in my chest and my belly. And so that was the first thing. And then I noticed kind of on the side over here, this constriction. And in my body, it feels like constriction of muscles, but it's a bit of anger. So I've got grief, anger, and then underneath the anger was hurt, which was felt kind of connected to the sadness and grief, but a little bit different. Then I noticed, so it was kind of like sadness, anger, then there was hurt underneath the anger, but then there was a part that was pointing and judging the hurt and saying, you're so selfish. You're making this all about you that, people can hurt you, your kids or whatever can hurt you in this way, and that's selfish. So I noticed a little inner critic there. And then that part and other parts felt shame, which is very painful. Shame is psychologically the most painful thing we can experience. So I felt that shame in my body, that closing down. Um, and then I just felt this incredible confusion. This came about more as kind of thoughts, and they were saying it was like asking questions, like, how do I get it right? I'm damned if I do, I'm damned if I don't. What am I supposed to do? What am I not supposed to do? I don't know. And it was just like this swirling, it felt like this really kinetic energy of I don't know how to be the right parent. Am I supposed to back off completely? Am I supposed to be more invested? It's different for each of the kids. I don't know what they want. They're not communicating to me. I sensed that the energy of this was so urgent that it was really my people pleasing team and my caretaking team and my mother parts that were all feeling like I just so badly want to be considered good and doing the right thing and pleasing the person in front of me. And so they felt really desperate, like they have to figure out how to do that. Right. And then, interestingly, there was another part that was um, polarized with that I called it rebellion, but it was like, what is this all worth? F it all. Just give up and follow your bliss and do whatever you want to do. And I found it really interesting that the parts, and this is so true on the inside, and we're going to talk about this with politics on the outside, because what's on the inside is so parallel to what's on the outside. My parts, I recognize, are so all or nothing, black or white, this extreme or that extreme, right? I've got to figure out and make my kids know that I care about them and do whatever they want me to do, or I've got to do nothing and just totally give up and say to heck with it, right? And that's kind of the parts at war inside of me. But deeper is sadness, grief, hurt, um, and then, of course, anger, protecting those. So I was able to kind of, and then the inner critics and the ones feeling shame. So again, no wonder I was feeling so much angst. I was able to identify one, two, three, four, five, six, seven parts around this. And some of them were clusters of parts. So it's just really helpful because as you begin to write it down, it becomes more clear. Oh, I've got all of these. So then what I did, it's kind of like what you do with nonviolent communication games, is I put these emotions, just kind of listed them across the page. Sadness, anger, hurt, shame, rebellion, confusion, and stress. And then I got curious, tried to kind of listen to the parts that were feeling those things, and I got curious about what is your unmet need. Now, when you do this, something that's supportive to me is I know that in Grok and in NVC, it actually can be quite supportive to have the nuance of a bunch of different needs and different emotions. But I like to have the 9 basic universal human needs described by Manfred Max Neef, because this is actually what Marshall Rosenberg used at the end of his teaching on nonviolent communication. And it just helps me to have a kind of this limited amount that I have memorized, because then I can go through and say, is it this? Is it this? Is it this? So then I'll just list them quickly here. The 9 universal human needs are sustenance, which is like air, um, water, food. So sustenance, safety, security, safety for our body, rest and or sleep, relaxation, recreation. So sustenance, safety, rest. And I like to remember them in 3 groups of 3 because that helps me. And then the others are kind of like interpersonal, but it's um, being valued or loved, being seen and heard and understood. So like empathy and belonging, which interestingly is also connected with respect, like kind of having equality and belonging and respect in a relationship. And community can kind of go in there with that. So those are kind of relational. And then the final 3 are purpose and meaning, um, creativity, and autonomy, freedom of choice. Now, these are all 9 universal human needs. So we can relate to each other on them because we all have the same needs. We might use different strategies to get them met or have different hierarchies of them in different situations, but we can relate to that need, right? So what I did, for example, is I went to the parts where I felt the heaviness of the sadness and I asked, what do you need? And the response was connection, purpose, and to matter. And then it was interesting. I went to the anger and I asked, do you need respect? Because sometimes anger will feel like I need respect. And it was interesting because later but I crossed it out because it didn't feel exactly resonant. And later my husband said, well, respect is really just being valued, right? And I said, yeah, actually, that's what the part landed on. Again, was like, I just want to matter. I just want to be valued. And then I asked the hurt ones, what is your need? And it said to matter, to be valued, to be loved. So you can see this common thread of like to matter, to be valued, to be loved. That's the first one and the second 3 there. And interestingly, I asked the ones feeling shame what they needed, and they said they needed rest from the inner and outer critics, that they needed rest from the parts inside and outside that are pointing at them and saying, you're so bad, you're so selfish. And so that was noted. Okay, I always can go and help my inner critics. And then the rebellious one, this was the one I kind of identified this before, but it was pointing at the people-pleasing, caretaking ones that so desperately wanted to be liked and be seen as good. And it was saying they're so extreme. Like we just have to pull in the opposite direction and not give any Fs, right? Because they give so many Fs. They have got all the Fs to give, and we have none. So I could see this very extreme pendulum swing kind of between the two. And then I asked the ones who basically the caretaking, people pleasing parts that felt the confusion and the stress and trying to figure it out. And they said they needed connection and approval to be seen as good. Um, and then I just kind of listened inside, and it was so interesting because um, my husband was saying that he doesn't he doesn't want to be hypocritical. So he feels like he didn't feel obligated to connect with his parents when he was our kids' age. And so he doesn't want to expect our kids to do that. And I totally get that and understand that and agree. I don't want my kids or anybody to interact with me out of obligation or duty because they have to and it's a chore. I don't want to be a chore for anybody. Um, but I heard parts saying it's actually parallel to my husband, but opposite. They were saying, I felt a certain obligation or duty. And so I expect other people also to feel a certain obligation or duty. And again was fascinating was I realized that a lot of my burden parts feel very black and white about this. Either you feel obligated and you do it with resentment, or you do it because you have to, or you don't do it at all. And later, what myself was saying was maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe it's not black and white. Maybe it's gray. Maybe there is some goodness to say, I care about this person and I want to reach out to them. I have a certain sense of conscience um, about it, but so I feel obligated, but without resentment. I also really do want to connect with them, whether it's my kids or my parents or whoever it is. So both can coexist in an unburdened way. So it doesn't have to be, I don't do anything I don't want to do and I could care less about anything, or I have to do everything that I don't want to do and feel resentment, right? That there is kind of a middle ground. Um, oh, and then I asked the parts, like, what are you afraid would happen if the parts of me that held obligation Like if you were free of that, if you were free to only interact with people if and when you wanted to and not feel any obligation or duty. And they said, I'm so afraid that if I don't have this burden of obligation, and if other people, my kids, my parents, don't have a burden of obligation to connect, we will not connect. We will have no relationship. And that's where the grief came in, because it's like, I don't want to face the reality that maybe we just don't care about each other, or we don't want to have relationship. And then another part chimed in and said, but often it's not that we both don't want to have relationship. It's usually one person wants to have relationship and the other doesn't. And that's devastating. And how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that grief, right? And it felt like the self was able to hold that and comfort that and just say, that's true. A relationship always takes two people. And relationships are amazing when both people are invested because they want to be, and giving and taking in equal measure, and free to show up if and when they want to. When they have that freedom, the person's giving to you because they want to. That's when you're going to have a thriving relationship. But if you're wanting that and giving that and the other person is not, you're kind of left to grieve, because a relationship always takes two people and you only have control over half that equation. So a lot of times what you are left with is grief. And so I felt like the self was saying, I will hold you. I will be with you if and when that happens. Um, and I will help you go through the grief and come to a place of acceptance, which is really, really hard because, and then I won't go into all the detail, but my parts have so many, they were showing me so many examples of, um, whether it's romantic relationships, friendships, children, where I was really, really wanting to have relationship. And it was just clear over and over that the other person did not, ghosting me, not responding to me. And the pain of that, the feeling of rejection, again, of not mattering, of not being valued by someone that you value and that you want to be in relationship with, is painful. It's really, really difficult. And I'm going to talk in a second about the We Can Do Hard Things podcast, where they were talking all about this. And it was such a balm to my soul because I felt so seen and heard by it. Um, but I'll just finish this really quickly. Yeah, so then it's basically my parts were all there, the needs were identified, and then myself with the parts, we came up with this, just a plan, a tentative plan of how can we get these needs met, in a strategy that is apart from specific people, which is really hard because my mother parts are like, I don't need just anybody to connect with me. I need my children. I don't need just anybody to value me. I need my children to value me. Right. And so it feels very attached to a specific person. But what the self gently said was, I know you need to matter. You need to know that you're valuable, and you need to know that you're good, and that you have good intentions, and that you're a good mom, and that you love your kids. And what it feels like, I'm going to cry, but what it feels like to the parenting parts, the mothering parts, is like, if my kids reflect back to me that they just don't want anything to do with me, it must be because I'm a bad mother. Like, what are they seeing? Who are they seeing in me? And so then those parts hold, they're confused. Like, am I bad? What do I need to do to be good? And so the self was saying, spend more time with me, just like this in this roundtable parts discussion, where I can reflect back the truth to you, that you are valuable, that you do matter, apart from your children, and that you do love them and you do your best with them. And you've made mistakes, but you're doing your best. And myself can reflect that back to me. Ironically, then when I'm secure in that and I'm not grasping at my children to prove that to me, I can actually be a better parent, right? Um, and another strategy was to in each moment ask, what do I want here? And that can change from child to child, from moment to moment. Because I had all these parts preparing, like, okay, for the holidays, we need to make sure that we're pleasing everybody. So we got to get all the right gifts. Like, should we get a Christmas tree? Um, should we put up any kind of decorations, even though we're moving, getting rid of everything in the house? Like, what should we do that will please the children? It was just very outward focused instead of saying, well, what do I want to do? And I don't know, maybe I want to get a tree, maybe I don't. Maybe I want to bake something, maybe I don't. Um, but it might be just that day waking up and saying, what do I want to do? Because when I'm so focused on what does everyone else want, I'm not ever checking what I want. And then I'm sometimes, maybe often giving and feeling resentful about it because it's actually not what I want. Um, and the last thing was, I talk a lot about this in my group, but there's this wonderful exercise that Martha Beck taught me that I call "They love me, they really love me." And so what it is if you're going into an environment where you have parts that are really insecure and fearful that people are going to reject you, criticize you, not like you, basically what you do is you do an imaginative exercise where you imagine yourself physically walking into that room and you imagine the people's faces just lighting up as they see you. And they are just delighted in you. They're so happy to see you. Their energy is so connected and embracing of you. And you feel that feeling state of feeling loved and accepted and delighted in. You fill yourself up with that. And so then essentially you're giving yourself what you are desiring from the other people before you even go into their presence, so that you kind of are grounded and secure and overflowing. And what's ironic is that you tend, because you're going in secure, other people reflect that back to you, and it becomes kind of you're kind of manifesting it. And it's not that you're pretending that people that don't like you, but the result for me, I remember doing this with my in-laws. I would pretend that I walk in the room and they're just like, ah, delighted in me and they like me and they're interested in me. Um, and so then when I would walk into the room and that wasn't the case, one, I would notice any indication of that truth, which I often would maybe ignore. And and if they weren't acting like that, I would think, huh, I wonder what's wrong. What's going on for them? I wouldn't take it personally. I would say, I wonder what's going on in their life that they're so close to me right now. Um, it's about them because they love me. They really love me. So it's not about me. Anyway, I've just found that really, really useful. And so myself and parts came up with that idea as well. All right. So I just wanted to talk really quickly about some of the things that were a catalyst for this, and maybe make some recommendations if it sounds interesting to you. But the most recent podcast of We Can Do Hard Things with Glennon, Abby, and Amanda is about raising older kids. And again, this is a wonderful thing where my husband was just so sweet to me because he did not identify or relate with what Glennon was saying. But I told him, I said, and I know, you don't really I said, but man, what she's saying is, I feel like she's articulating exactly how I feel. And he said, oh, I want to listen to this with you because I want to understand you. And again, that helped meet a need for me of being valued and understood, even though it's not his experience. And that's something wonderful, I think, that my husband and I have, that I wish for all couples, is to allow each other to be different and to not expect the other person to be the same, but to also really want to understand where the other person is coming from. Um, I don't think couples thrive when they're just always exactly the same and always agreeing on everything. It's when they are not threatened or judgmental toward their partner for being different. Anyway, I'll just say a few things that I related to here was Glenda was talking about how she had basically an identity crisis, that who she was the mother of these children. And as they got older and they didn't need her anymore and they didn't even want her anymore, it wasn't like really what's going to happen to them, though that was part of it. It was what's going to happen to me. What do I do? And I remember telling a young man that was here that's my son's age or around my son's age. Um, it was really therapeutic coming together. He had a very similar experience with his mother. And I was explaining to him that for a long time there, especially when my two boys were in high school, they were still at home, but they really didn't need me as much. And so I found myself just sitting on the couch all day, just waiting for if and when they needed me. Right. And finally, I just said, I can't just keep sitting here. So then that's when I started writing and producing content and, doing more and more online and with groups and pursuing things that made me come alive. And then just more recently, right, Brian and I taking off and going to Ecuador for 2 months. And there are parts of me that feel like, oh my gosh, am I abandoning my children? What if they need me physically in the next 2 months? You know, uh, just stressed about that. And it was so wonderful because this young man, he said, oh my goodness, I would be so happy if my mom pursued what made her happy and what gave her life. And it made me realize, oh, when I'm just so waiting and invested in them, it's like they feel this pressure, right? Like I've got to make my mom feel more secure and feel happy. Like they're responsible for that. And that's a huge burden. They do not need to carry that. So I'm actually not being selfish, being kind by saying, I'm going to take care of myself. I'm going to pursue my bliss in essence. I'm here. I'm available to you if you need me, but I'm not just going to wait around. I'm going to pursue life-giving things for me. Um, Another thing that Glennon said that sounds really extreme, but is actually really helpful for me. She was talking about how when kids get older and they differentiate from their parents and they basically are going out of the nest, it's essentially like they have to kill off their parents. And some people do it when they're 16. Some people do it 20, 30, 40, right? Like I didn't start questioning just the presuppositions and the conditioning of my upbringing until I was about 40. A little bit before that, but and in some ways it's like you have to kill off, it sounds really extreme, but the conduits of that, which is often your parents and religious leaders and teachers and things like that. Because in order to reject that and form your own path and your own identity and realize what's my authenticity, what are my values, you have to say no to that in a really strong way. And so there might be a period of time where there's essentially a feeling of rejection. And I know that myself and my husband, we've had to do that in essence with our own parents and in our own way. And so it makes sense that our kids will do that. I think there's just a part of me that's like, how long is that going to go on? Are we ever going to reconnect? Are they ever going to resurrect me? But just knowing that that is natural and normal and important. And you know what? That part that was saying, I don't know what to do. How do I do the right thing? I feel like I can't get it right. It was like confirmation that no, it doesn't matter what you do. You can't get it right because they have to reject you in essence, no matter what you do or how you are. There has to be some level or form of rejection so that they can mature and create their own identity. Um, and just that yeah, the desperation and grasping at them really pushes them away. But again, Glennon said something like, or maybe it was Amanda said, it's difficult to accept that they don't need us anymore because that was our whole life's purpose before. Like the part said, I need purpose now. What is my purpose without my kids, right? But she said, they're at a stage in their life where they don't need us anymore, but we want them to want us. Hopefully they want us. And I think, but that was the part of me that felt grief. It was like, okay, if they don't feel obligated and they don't need me anymore, but they're also showing me they don't want me. And that feels painful. It feels like rejection. Um, last thing was, oh, Glennon said she was just talking about how the world is so scary for her and it's full of so much pain and suffering. And she just can't protect her kids anymore from that. And they're out in the world and she doesn't know what kind of pain and suffering they're going to experience. And that's really scary. And I so related to that. And I think it was Amanda said, oh no, I think it was Abby said, so do you think that the world is just all suffering and there's no good? And she said, no, 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 I don't think that. I think maybe there's 51% good and 49% bad, but that's a lot of bad. That's a lot of suffering. And I relate, I was telling my husband, for a long time, I identified as an Enneagram 1, but I am convinced now that I'm an Enneagram 4 because I so relate to Glennon. I so relate to so many people in my groups who identify as 4s. I'm just so deeply feeling. And I know that I have experienced so much suffering, whether it was the abuse in my first marriage, my first husband's death by suicide, the major inner critics that are inside of me, the, just the pain and suffering of feeling suicidal, right? I don't ever, ever want my children to feel that. And so, because I've experienced suffering, and then I had physical suffering for over a year, and then with perimenopausal because of other suffering, it feels like there's periods of suffering and relief, but so much suffering from being conditioned, also from religion and so many different things. And I understand that that's how life is. It's just full of suffering and relief from the suffering and learning and then more suffering. But it's kind of like, oh, I just wish I could protect my children from that, that they wouldn't have to experience that. And maybe they won't experience it in the same way that I do. Obviously, not exactly the same. But me worrying about it and trying to protect causes more suffering for them. So, again, turning toward myself and doing what really asking myself, what's going to make me be healthy and thrive and come alive? Right. I've been able to do that here in Ecuador with this distance. I wake up every day and just do what is life-giving for me. And I've all of my physical symptoms have abated. I have more energy than I've had in years. I feel healthy in mind and body. I'm excited about life. Um, and I think I have parts that are just afraid I'm going to go back to the States and fall back into worrying about what everybody else wants, overriding my own needs, and then going into physical and um, mental and uh, just my nervous system's collapse, right? So this has been really, really wonderful. Okay. I know I've been talking for a while. So I also do want to talk about the election tomorrow. And what got me really thinking about this was another podcast. It's called You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes. And I think on Fridays, I prefer these episodes. Pete Holmes and his wife Val just have these conversations with each other. And I find them so interesting and so stimulating. It sounds like me and my husband having a conversation. Both Pete and his wife Val are in IFS therapy. And so they talk about their parts. And Pete's a 4 and his wife is a 9. And I am a 4 and my husband's a 9. So, and they just talk about deep things and it's so fascinating. So they were talking about what I was just talking about a second ago about how we have parts inside that are so polarized and they're so black and white. And it's like one pulls to this crazy extreme over here, and then the other pulls in the equal and opposite extreme. And it really is a polarized system's way of trying to achieve balance. It's not ideal. I don't think it has to be that way. If our system is self-led, but it is so parallel on the outside. So they were talking about politically how we'll have like a very conservative uh, government, I guess, leadership, and then it will pull in the equal and opposite direction of being very liberal and progressive. And then it'll pull back in the other direction of being ultra conservative and then ultra progressive, right? And it just keeps going back and forth. And so almost like it's kind of to be expected that this, just like it happens on the inside, it's likely going to happen on the outside because unfortunately, I don't think our country, our culture, definitely in America and most of the world probably is very self-led at this point. My husband was saying that he said, you know, it's kind of like the pendulum, right? It's this extreme, that extreme, but gradually it starts getting closer and closer to the center and has a little bit more moderation. But he said, I picture like a cat that's like hit like an outside force that's like keeps hitting the ball so that it keeps on going extreme to extreme. So I agree. There may be kind of outside forces that somehow benefit from the extreme to the extreme. And so that continues on rather than kind of getting to this more gray, both and all and place. And so I was thinking about this because tomorrow is the election in the States, and I really wanted to meet with my parts who, and I very rarely talk about my political stance on things, so you're going to learn some things about where I stand. Um, um, and I often don't talk about it because I don't ever want to alienate anyone. I know that everyone comes by their positions very honestly. And when I was in conservative Christianity, I was right-leaning Republican. When I started to deconstruct those things and really question my conditioning, I became very left Democrat. During the pandemic, when I had basically had a lot of medical trauma and been harmed by a lot of medications and procedures, and absolutely did not want to put something in my body because I had had so many side effects and different complications from other medications. And I was told that because I didn't want, uh, that I wanted to make a choice for myself to not put this foreign substance in my body, that that meant that I was a very right-leaning Republican. I was so aghast. I was so, what? And so then what I realized was that uh, politically, it's kind of like not just a left and right. It's actually there's also a y-axis that is authoritarian and libertarian. And that for me, I always thought that the left was essentially libertarian because they're progressive, they're for human rights, they're for freedoms. And one of the biggest values that my system has is for freedom and autonomy for all people and rights for all people and people being treated equally. And so what I realized though is it was really fascinating. It showed that both the left and the right, though, are very much skewed in the upper quadrant of authoritarianism, and that they want to have power over and make decisions for others in different areas, right? Like we want to make our decisions to have the freedom to have guns. We want the freedom to have abortions. We want freedom, for the vaccine. We want freedom for um, all people to marry, right? And I realized like I'm on both your sides. I want freedom, all the freedoms. I just want everybody to have all the freedoms. And so I realized that I'm actually like in the center down here. And I used to think that, and so people might call that libertarian, but I sometimes I don't like to use that term because I guess when I was left, I always thought that libertarian was like even further right, which now I understand is not the case. It's actually down here. Um, and so I'll tell you. And again, what I value and what my experiences have led me to is personal to me. And it doesn't mean that I'm saying you have to agree with me or you have to have the same experience as me. I get that everyone comes by their positions honestly. And so my real hope is that all this polarization and demonization of one another can um, come closer to the center. So what I did though is just like with the last one, I drew a circle and I wrote the election in the center. This time, instead of emotions coming up, it was really more like memories. And so the biggest memory for me was of the election in 2016. And I remember going to bed the night of the election day and just totally convinced by the results that were coming in that we were going to have our first female president and that Hillary Clinton was going to be president. And I was so excited. And when I woke up the next morning and I was told, no, Trump won, I was in shock and disbelief. I didn't believe it. I was like, no, 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 that's not true. That you're kidding, right? And then I proceeded to go on my walk outside in the neighborhood that I did every single day, all through the neighborhood. And there were people driving, yelling out of their trucks, "Long live King Trump," yelling out at people of color, saying, "Go back to where you came from." Um, it was, I felt suddenly in this space where I walked every day like a complete foreigner and like I was no longer safe. It was just really, really crazy experience. I wanted to leave and go to Canada or go somewhere else. I felt like people are out to get me, right? So then as I'm walking, I'm coming back and I meet a neighbor woman. She and I at that point had been really close friends. And I said something about how I'm just feeling really disappointed. And she who was a Trump supporter was like, "Why?" And so I tried to be vulnerable and divulge to her that Trump reminded me of my first husband, who was my abuser. And she looked at me kind of with disdain and she said, "Oh my gosh, Christine, Trump is not an abuser. He's not a bully. That's like so extreme of you." And I felt so, I don't even know how to explain the feeling that I felt in that moment. It was so crazy because I felt so like shamed and unseen, unvalued, um, misunderstood. Like suddenly I'm the alien in this country and it's not safe. I genuinely felt so not safe that before I knew it, my body just started running. I mean, she was in the mid-sentence and I started trucking it all the way up the street to my house until I got through the door and shut the door and locked the door as if some perpetrator was chasing me up the street. And to be honest with you, I never walked in my neighborhood again. I would walk behind in the green belt I was like, nature is safe. People are not safe. And I genuinely like never had a close relationship with that neighbor again because I felt so, yeah, I guess the word is just unsafe. And so anyway, so I was asking my parts, I'm like, we need to be prepared for whatever happens. Um, because at that time, when Trump won, what it felt like to my system was he reminds me so much of my first husband, even similar name, but just mm, how do you describe it? Like I would say narcissistic qualities and kind of saying outrageous things, being very controlling, assuming that he did nothing wrong and it's always someone else's fault and they always need to be punished. Um, just so many different qualities reminded me of my first husband, who was my abuser. And so it felt like half of the nation had voted my abuser into the highest position in the country. And I thought, I mean, this is a vote, like personally against me, is what it felt like. Now, when I'm in self, I know that's not true. I know that people vote for Donald Trump for many reasons. Maybe they're lifelong Republicans and that's all they feel like they have the choice to do. Maybe they're, one topic voters and it's about abortion and that's it. And so they overlook all the other things. Maybe they've had really negative experiences with big government and they think that he's for smaller government or he's for the middle class or maybe they identify with him like they don't, they're feel like people who've led in the past are more intellectual and uh, studious or I don't know. And so they think he's just every man's man and he says whatever he thinks. And maybe there again, the pendulum swing from political correctness and saying all the right things to here's this guy who says all the wrong things. And we appreciate that. I don't know. But I get that people come by their opinions honestly. It doesn't necessarily mean that they support misogyny and racism and all of those things, though I have parts that or it's hard for them to wrap their head around that. So I know it's not personal when I'm in self, but I have parts that have just been through so much trauma and have burden around it. And so they get really activated. So I said, okay, I really want to be prepared come Wednesday for whatever the result is. So I kind of just imagine that Trump wins. What does my system need from me if that happens? And the consensus seemed to be we need you to kind of be a hermit for a little bit. And, to be honest, there's a reason my husband and I are not in the country during the election because we just, and so I'm already supporting my system in that way. But I don't know that my system could handle anything like 2016 of going out and seeing people rejoicing or just discounting my experiences, right? And so I just think my system will need to be a hermit for a good week or two. Um, don't watch the news, kind of stay away from things that are triggering, and just meet with my parts as much as I need to. Once a day, twice a day, 28 times a day, however much they need. If they're activated, go inside and tend to them. And when I was thinking about this, there was a part of me that was kind of critical that was saying, if you were just evolved, if you were a really healed and evolved enough person, you would be able to handle anything that happens. Whoever wins the election, however people talk to you, whatever their choices are, you would just let it roll off your back, like a duck, water off a duck's back. But there was actually this little statement that I think it was Val in You Made It Weird with Pete Holmes and his wife Val. She said this little statement and it was so impactful to me. Okay, and I don't even know how much of it she said. My brain like expanded it and just really gravitated toward it. But it was something about like you wear a coat when it's cold outside. When it's storming outside, you wear a coat, right? And the way my parts and my system took that was, yeah, you don't think that somebody who goes out in a big ice storm without a coat is like this great, healthy, strong person. I mean, I guess sometimes people do think that with all the cold plunge people, or, you know, but I mean, not going out eh, for a long period of time in a blizzard without a coat. You think, oh, they put a coat on in the blizzard. Of course they did. That's smart, right? So why would we think that if we have parts that are vulnerable and are going to be exposed to a storm, that we wouldn't put a coat on when we go out into that storm? That's not a weak thing. That's not an unevolved thing. It's Of course, we're going to do that. And it's actually, if I create a coat, essentially, which is kind of like these nuanced boundaries around people, maybe I'm just not going to talk about politics with people. Or if I know that my parts are activated, I'm going to go to a private place. I'm going to put the support system around my parts. Then I don't actually have to be so extreme because what my parts think is I need to go outside with no coat on, naked in the storm, or stay inside completely. But what if I could wear a coat outside, right? There is no shame in that, right? That's actually a very smart thing to do. And finally, I also went through the scenario for myself, just of imagining Kamala winning and what that would look like for my system. And again, this may be totally different or opposite for your system, and I support that. My biggest thing is really lovingly be with your parts wherever they are, um, tend to them. So imagining Kamala winning. Now, again, because both left and right parties are kind of up here in authoritarian land, I don't agree with everything that Kamala says or does. Don't necessarily agree with her position, um, or that any of the parties' position on how to help Palestine and Gaza right now. I do not agree with any of them and how they're handling it. Um, I do not agree with just taking away other people's freedoms in any capacity on either side. Um, I I feel as though in order to be successful in government, you have to be a certain kind of power over person to some degree. And so anyone who's a politician, I'm not the biggest fan of. However, so many of the things that I value are more in alignment with Kamala. My system, just like I was saying, some people maybe they identify more with Trump. He's the everyman's man or something, and they identify with that. I identify with Kamala. As a woman, she's a little bit older than me. She's more studious. I would say she has more managers. I'm a more manager-driven system. Uh, I think Trump's a more firefighter-driven system, just impulsive, say whatever. And she's a little bit more contained and PC, but I relate to that. She represents me, right? And so in imagining waking up on Wednesday, Kamala has won, my system feels light and bright and hopeful and like, oh my gosh, this supposedly progressive nation has finally elected a woman to the highest position in the land. But then there's this vulnerability in that hopefulness, right? Like identifying that my parts feel so excited and so hopeful. There's so much invested. It's like a desperate hope that I'm like, okay, I need to be so loving and tender with you. Because if that's not the outcome, you're going to be very tender and exposed. And we're going to have to get a big coat. But also, if that does happen, to be so understanding and conscious of the fact that there are going to be people on the other side who feel exactly like I did when Trump was elected. And I want to be so kind and sensitive and understanding of that, that their parts genuinely believe that a world in which Kamala is president is unsafe for them. And when that people supporting Kamala is means they're anti them and they feel unsafe and they feel vulnerable. And so I so want to be not necessarily shouting and celebrating in the streets, though I'm going to be doing that inside for sure. Um, but just being conscious of the other people, doing to others as I would have them do it to me, right? Um, and so, yeah. So I might kind of be a little bit of a hermit either way, but in one I'll be tending to all my wounded parts, and the other I'll be having a little party inside. Um, and again, I am just sharing this with you as an example. your example could be opposite or somewhere in between. Um, and I do not think if you're opposite of me that you're a bad person. I've had lots of conversations with people here in Ecuador that are on all kinds of places on the spectrum politically. And what's wonderful is that we feel a commonality because we have come to another country and are in some ways countercultural to some degree. And I can really listen to their stories and say, gosh, everybody makes sense. Every person, every part makes sense. You come by whatever you believe, whatever your position is, honestly. And if we can all understand that about ourselves and each other, we don't have to agree with each other. Ironically, this is what Biden said in the vice presidential election um, when he was running with Obama, and he had the debate with him and the woman from Alaska. Forgetting her name. Gosh. Oh, why am I forgetting her name? Anyway, one of the things I love that he said was, I do not have to agree with someone to believe that they have good intentions and that they come by their position honestly. So I don't have to hate them. I don't have to make them the enemy. Like we can agree to disagree. And yes, I may not like that. I may want them to agree with me, but believing they're evil, they're bad, they're stupid is what creates so much war and suffering and conflict. It's the same things. I'll just bring it back to the inside. When parts point at each other and they're like, you are evil, you are bad, it just creates more and more conflict and polarization inside. But once we go inside and we say, look, maybe what you're doing is harmful and I don't agree with you, but I know you make sense, even if it's a big inner critic, a suicidal part, an addictive part, you're doing this for a reason. You're trying to protect me. You've had experiences. What happened to you? What are you afraid would happen if you didn't do this? I know you can't stop until what you protect is healed. I know you have good intention. When we begin to appreciate extreme parts or extreme others outside, that while they have understand legitimate negative, harmful impact, they have good intention, then they don't have to be our enemy. It really is a both and of those things. We can disagree, recognize harmful impact, and understand they have good intention. And so ultimately, when I'm in self, I can see that in Trump, in everybody. Um, don't agree with them, want a boundary. They're not the enemy. They come by it honestly. All right. That was a big, long rant. If you're still here with me, I'm amazed. Um, but thank you for listening to this. I hope that you're able to get curious about your own parts, whether it's about holidays, about elections, anything going on in the world, in your life. It's always beneficial to turn inside and listen to your parts and be with them. So if you have any questions or any comments about what I talked about, please leave them in the comments below.